Perfect. So thank you for joining us. This is our first Women in Agile Bulgaria session, and we'll give everyone a minute or more to start, but to join us. Before we start, I would like to remind you that this session will be recorded. So please keep your cameras off and your mics muted for better sound and picture quality. First, we will go through our agenda for today. We will start with a short introduction of Women in Agile. Then Bogdana will continue with introduction of our wonderful speaker. The session for nudge theory will take around 40 minutes, and at the end we will have 20 minutes for Q&A, where you'll be able to discuss your learnings with our speaker. For a start, I would like to say a few words about Women in Agile. That's our parent organization. Women in Agile is a non-profit and a collective effort to recruit, network, promote, and support the work of outstanding women in the Agile community through blogging, speaking at events, and building a network among all people. For this to be possible, I would request all attendees to keep a code of conduct for this meeting by being respectful to all participants in the meeting today. With this, I would like to give the word to Bogdana. Bogi?
Thank you, Sevi. A warm welcome from me as well. We believe in the values of Women in Agile and are passionate about building the Bulgarian part of this worldwide organization. Our goal is to promote diversity and inclusion and to create chances for like-minded people to meet and exchange experience and ideas. We strive to contribute to the Bulgarian Agile community by creating a safe space not only for women, but for all people, where we can learn from one another and build each other up. This is the Women in Agile Bulgaria team: Evelina Chaldukova, local leader and co-organizer, Severina Todorova, co-organizer and multimedia design lead, and I'm Bogdana Boncheva, and I'm very happy to be sharing the same dream with my teammates of creating a meaningful experience and a chance for self-growth for all of us here today. We would like to extend a special thank you to our logo designer, Dilyana Stoyanova, who managed to stay true to the Women in Agile artistic expression, but also reflected the beautiful Bulgarian identity in our logo. Thank you so much, Didi. We appreciate you. And now it's my honor to introduce to you our speaker today, Sarah Wells. Sarah is a technology leader, a consultant, and conference speaker with a focus on microservices, engineering enablement, observability, and DevOps. Sarah has really done it all in her impressive 20-year career as a developer, principal engineer, director across product, platform, SRE, and DevOps teams. Sarah has spent over a decade at the Financial Times, where she was leading while it transformed into a true cloud-native organization, embracing empowered autonomous teams. Sarah is currently writing a book for O'Reilly about enabling microservice success. You can connect with her on Twitter. Amongst her many accomplishments, Sarah has mentored numerous professionals, inspiring them to achieve much more than they thought was possible. And I know that because I'm one of them. Thank you so much, Sarah, for being with us here today and inspiring us to learn about nudge theory and how we can use it with our teams. We'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation, but you can keep them coming in the chat box. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me. Let me just share my screen. Great. Can you see the title slide? Excellent. Brilliant. Oh, thank you for that fantastic intro. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk about nudge theory. Hello. So as Bogdana said, I until the end of last year, I worked at the Financial Times. I was technical director for engineering enablement. I'd been there for 11 years, and over the time that I was at the Financial Times, things changed a lot. We'd invested pretty heavily in things that let us move faster, automation, infrastructure as code. We'd adopted DevOps, so teams running their own systems. And that really changed a lot of things about the culture, the organization, and the way that teams interacted. And teams in the Financial Times are pretty empowered to make the right decisions for themselves, which means it's really difficult to enforce top-down mandates and tell people what to do. So as leadership or as teams that are trying to do things that support other teams, you have to find other ways to influence people to do the right thing. So today I want to talk about why not being able to rely on telling people what to do is a good thing, and how we can learn from behavioural economics and nudge theory to find good ways to persuade and influence teams to do the things that matter to us. So I'll start with the challenge, why I think we shouldn't tell people how to do things. We shouldn't tell them what they need to do. Secondly, the theory, what is nudge theory? And finally, the practice, which is examples of things that we did while I was at the FT and how they relate back to the ideas from nudge theory. And apologies if I say we for the FT. I was there a long time. It's really difficult not to say that. So support for changing the ways we worked at the Financial Times came right from the top. The board of the FT encouraged the product and tech department to think about ways to try things out and to take on some risk. They wanted to be able to respond to change. And they talked about Kodak. So Kodak's core business is film and printing, film cameras, printing photos. They were one of the largest companies in the world in the 1990s, but by 2011 they were filing for bankruptcy. And it's very easy to assume this was the case of someone a company that were blinded by their success and had missed the whole idea of digital cameras. But as the URL here says, their downfall wasn't about the technology. Kodak, an engineer at Kodak, actually created the first prototype digital camera. They invested heavily. They spent billions in building digital cameras. They also bought a photo sharing site in the early 2000s. They knew that digital cameras were important, but they saw it as an expansion, not a replacement of their core business. On their photo sharing site, they focused on encouraging people to print out those photos, not just to share them. They didn't get the social side of it was coming. They couldn't execute the necessary change. And the FT board said, we don't want to be Kodak. We want to make sure we explore and fully explore opportunities. We want to be able to try things out. And if you're really going to experiment, you have to be able to do it both quickly and cheaply. So the core things that transformed our technology department over the last decade were continuous delivery and decoupled architectures. A continuous delivery means having code that's always ready to deploy, automated pipelines to deploy that code, and regularly shipping code through those pipelines. So often people build automated pipelines, but they're still not releasing code all the time they need to. Together with a decoupled architecture, which allows you to make a small change and release it independently, feeling pretty confident you're not going to break something somewhere else. That does mean that teams can try things out very quickly, days rather than weeks or months. But to benefit, teams have to be able to work independently. They can't wait for some other team to make a decision. They can't wait to have access to a shared staging environment. They don't want to have to go to a change approval board that says you can go to test tomorrow. Which means we want teams to be autonomous with all the skills they need for building and deploying a feature within the team, and empowered so they can make their own decisions about technology. With those two things, you get that quick feedback, and that's great, especially when it turns out you're not building the right thing. You need to stop and try something else. If you are moving fast, you can't hand code over to a separate operations team to run it in production. So you need to run it yourself. You build it, you run it, you support your own code in production. This has a lot of great benefits because I think you build things differently when you're the one that could get phoned up in the middle of the night to fix it. But you can't expect developers to support tech that they wouldn't have chosen. When we started building systems using microservices, we talked to the dev teams to say what would need to be in place to make you feel comfortable doing overnight support. And lots of those things turned out to be architectural. This data store doesn't feel stable enough. This isn't the right software for our use case. It's too complicated. And the problems with that were because it's bound to happen if you have a central team making tech choices. Something that's right for one team or one use case may not be right for another team. So one size does not fit all. But while teams may be autonomous, there are many downsides to allowing a complete free-for-all in terms of the tech that they use. What happens when another team has to take over a service? services get moved between teams all the time as an organization responds to change or realizes that the service is not being owned by the right team. If you wrote a service in Clojure, but the team it's moving to are all Node developers, that makes the transfer very complicated. So that's a real problem. But it's not just about when you realize that you needed a service to move to a different team. It's also about moving people in general, because things change in organizations all the time. Someone new joins and they have a different view of what's important. The industry you're working in changes. There's a new possibility because there's a new tech that you can use, or maybe legislation, something like GDPR had that impact in a lot of companies. You need to react to it, you need to be flexible. If you've finished a big rebuild of something, do you keep all of the people who are working on that project, or could you move some of them to a new, more important problem? But this is where the idea that autonomous teams have complete flexibility to use whatever language, database, or tooling they want starts to come off the rails. It's really good for developers to move teams. It's really good for teams to have developers move teams. You share different experiences and it helps shape the team and change things. But if things are too different, people won't want to move. If you have to move to a new team and you have to learn to deploy to AWS rather than to Heroku, to use Java rather than JavaScript, to use different data stores, it's very daunting. And I think programming language in particular can be very painful, because it's not that you can't pick up a new programming language, although some are easier than others. It's also that you've probably invested quite a bit in understanding this programming language, its ecosystem, the packages you use. Maybe you go to conferences and meet people and have connections that are all part of that. It is very difficult to say to someone who is a Java developer, we now need you to go and be a Node developer. So you need to be thinking about how do you move people. So that complete autonomy is a challenge. And then there are higher level goals. There are goals that are important to a software development organization that matter to the company, that may not be super relevant to an individual team, but they really do matter to the company as a whole. So one aspect is about risk. So the Financial Times do not want to be in the news for being hacked. They don't want to waste their money. So an example of cost control, the tension with cost control is, let's say, cloud costs. As a developer, I want to spin up a new resource because I've got a new product idea. I'm probably going to give it plenty of memory and CPU because I don't want there to be any problems. But as a department, we don't want to be over specifying all of our instances. And you want to be able to operate your complete software stack, which is hard where everything is different. And also, while we talk about autonomous cross-functional teams, product teams can't be truly autonomous. They shouldn't be truly autonomous, because you shouldn't have all the expertise you need within them. They should have the things they need to be able to build, develop, deploy, and test features. But sometimes you're doing something different. Maybe you're adding a WAF in front of your website. You're adding a CDN. You're about to try your first serverless project. You should be able to go to someone else who can be an expert in that area. If you want product teams to focus on delivering value, you want to be able to hand off some of the knowledge to other people. So you need, in my view, teams that provide common services. But there are a couple of different ways to do this. So I want to talk a little bit about the Financial Times' first attempt to provide a single platform for product development teams, which was about 7 or 8 years ago and was created by a central tooling team. It was click button provisioning of machines in a private cloud and later AWS. And it was a massive improvement over our previous manual provisioning and setup. When I joined, it took 6 months to get the server ready to deploy our code to for a new product. Now it was 15 minutes. Everything was set up with infrastructure as code, automation as standard. You didn't have to do anything special to end up with an application that could be redeployed using Puppet, that had monitoring turned on and shipped logs to a log aggregation system. So that sounds absolutely great. But it was built so that lots of decisions were made for you. And that was really helpful when we had teams where this was all new. So it's a bit like having training wheels on a bike. It kept you stable. But if you joined the FT and you were already used to using AWS, you would get frustrated because there were things you couldn't do because the platform had abstracted that away. And early iterations were built without really thinking about the end users, the development teams. So I was a developer and user of this platform. I could provision a virtual machine, but I couldn't deploy my application to it because I didn't have the permissions. I had to go and find someone with sysadmin permissions to be able to deploy code onto that VM. So it's not really thinking about the friction of doing that. And actually, it's not really thinking about the sensible risk, because I could have spun up 10,000 VMs. Would have been very expensive, but I wouldn't have been able to put code on any of them. And upgrades were forced. There were a couple of iterations, and each time, if you weren't on the latest platform, you didn't get any improvements and you had to move. But who wants to stop and upgrade their internal platform? And I want to be fair to the FT's tooling team. They really responded to this feedback. They fixed the problems about permissions. They did the last upgrade to my team, but really the problem was that a platform locks you in. You have to use all of it. Maybe you only want a part. And if it is abstracting away complexity, it's also stopping you from being able to do stuff. So really there's a problem with that. So autonomous teams need to be free to make a different choice. And this is a great blog post from Matt Chapman, who's now a product director at the FT, but was a tech director, 6 years old, but it's still true. Talking about the fact that you are internal service providers when you're building things that other teams use within your company. You should be able to build something that they really want to use, because you're right there with your customers and you can understand them deeply, and you only have to meet their needs. So the challenge is about finding a balance between standardization and autonomy. And if you imagine the pendulum, you have one end where everything is standardized, and at the other end you have entirely separate technologies. In the middle, you maybe specify some guardrails, what you expect people to do as part of their work. And maybe you start building a paved road, something that provides an easy route for people. I think you need to be somewhere around where the arrow is. I think it means you should be building tools and APIs over platforms so that your clients can use the bits that are useful to them and ignore the bits that aren't. And that's something that the FT now has, which is a set of tools that do one thing, do it well. Teams can compose them how they wish. Team topologies, when I read it, was was eye-opening, because it just really summarized things we had learned over the previous decade of doing DevOps and microservices. It's talking about how do you organize teams so that you can deliver fast flow of work. And the description around different types of teams is really interesting. So team topologies defines a stream-aligned team. It's really a product development team. It's a team that is working on a stream of work aligned to a particular problem that they're trying to solve. And then you have platform and enabling teams. And the team topologies describes them as two different things, but really they're both teams that are allowing other teams to be more productive by building tooling, providing insight, maybe expert advice and training. An example at the FT would be the cloud enablement team. They're experts in AWS. They can protect teams from any mistakes. So, for example, they can make sure teams have separate accounts and that permissions and access is appropriately locked down. They focus on costs. They provide advice to people. They teach them how to use new technology. So you have a set of tools and APIs. How do you persuade teams to use them? And I want to mention that I'm going to talk a lot here about those teams that provide tools and services, central and platform teams. But all of these challenges were there when I was working on a team that built APIs that other teams within the FT used. How do you persuade the people who consume that API to move to a new version? Because you have to influence. So anytime that you're asking another team to do something, a team where you don't control the backlog, you can use these techniques to try and make it more likely that you'll be able to get them to do it. So the challenge is about influencing behavior rather than enforcing it. And the theory that I'm going to talk about is behavioral economics, or nudge theory. So simply, a nudge is a means of encouraging or guiding behavior. So without mandating, ideally without financial incentives or sanctions. So it's a difference between putting up no littering signs and imposing fines versus making sure that there are litter bins everywhere. And in fact, when I was looking for pictures of litter bins, I found an article that said different shaped bin lids like this picture can make a significant impact on whether people throw stuff away in the right bins. Shaped lids increased correct recycling by 34%, which is a huge difference just by changing the shape of a lid on a bin. It's a classic example of a nudge. Nudge was named and popularized by the book on the left, which was published in 2008. If you've read Thinking Fast and Slow, which was massively popular, that covers some of the same ground. Some of the same research group that wrote about that. And nudge has proved very attractive to governments, partly because it's about what you can do without spending money. And as an example, the Cameron government in the UK and the Obama administration in the US both had behavioural economists working for them. And Obama published an executive order in 2015 encouraging government departments to adopt the things from behavioural economics to encourage people to do things. Probably a little bit less popular in the UK and the US recently, but it's still used by a lot of other governments. And there's a book that David Halpern, who ran the Nudge Unit in the UK, wrote, and a lot of what I'm going to say in the rest of this talk comes from this book. It was really interesting. But I'm going to start with the canonical example from nudge theory, which is a picture of a urinal from Schiphol Airport. And if you look closely at it, there's a little black fleck, and it's a fly, or rather it's a picture of a fly. And the idea is that you're giving something to aim at. And if there's something to aim at, then there's less chance that you're going to miss it. And the manufacturer says it saved cleaning costs, reduced cleaning costs by 20%. Now, this is interesting because you can take this with a pinch of salt, because there doesn't seem to have been any kind of real research here. It's just a manufacturer saying, ta-da! And mostly when there's nudge theory, there are trials that actually test this. But the idea is a small change can have a big impact. An example in the UK is the organ donation register. So in the UK, organ donation is via an opt-in. You have to say you want to do it. So research shows that 90% of people support donating their organs after death, but only about 30% have registered to do it. When you apply for a driving license or a new car tax in the UK, as part of that flow on the site, you're prompted to sign up for the organ donation register. So the UK government ran a large randomized control trial with 8 variants. So they're quite small, but I'll talk through them. The first one is just the standard form, the control. The second one talks about social norms. So it says lots of people sign up at this point. The third and fourth are basically the same, but they have pictures, because previous research had suggested that if you add a relevant picture, people are more likely to donate to charity. So there was an attempt to see, well, does this work? Does this work in the same way? Number 5 is framing things in terms of negative consequences if you don't do it. Number 6 is framed in terms of positive consequences if you do it. 7 is framed in terms of reciprocity. Do to others what you want done to you. You might need this, so why don't you sign up? And the final one points out a gap between the intention and the numbers of people who register. So which of these worked? It turns out that the reciprocity does the best. The idea that if you should do this because you might need to benefit from it is the thing that made people much more likely to sign up. That's number 7 on here. What's interesting is if you look at number 3, that is the picture version of the standard one, and it does worse than the one without the picture. That wasn't as predicted. This is why you do a test. You can see that it had more worse effect. Framing in terms of negative outcome, that's number 5, worked better than framing in terms of positive outcome. So it all seems like not a huge difference if you look at the numbers, but what does it mean in terms of overall numbers? So over the course of a year, this difference would lead to approximately 96,000 additional completed registrations. And it's very interesting when you look at any of these things around the government, because 1% difference can make a big difference when you're talking about 60 million people. So potential population of the UK, potential impact of something. So small differences can save a lot of money. They can make a lot of difference in terms of number of people who have registered. My next example is something I noticed myself, which was around travel during the London Olympics, because I had read the book by this point. And so the Olympics in 2012 happened in the middle of London, and London Transport for London said, well, there are going to be 62 million journeys during the Olympics, and there'll be an increase of 35% over normal traffic levels. And it's going to hit certain stations really hard. So hotspot stations like Waterloo, they ran a campaign. There were posters saying this is going to be busy. They gave out maps of walking routes saying, well, if you walk for 5 minutes, you can go to this other station instead. They encouraged alternative routes, and London Bridge was one of these hotspot stations, and it's the tube station that I took to work to get to the Financial Times. So I had seen posters that said I might have to queue for half an hour to get onto a tube. And I did take a picture of the tube the day that the first day of the Olympics, but I've lost it. But this is basically what it looked like. There were absolutely no people on the tube during rush hour on the first weekday morning of the Olympics. It was significantly lower than during a normal working day. And the research they did after the Olympics said more than 3/4 of the London travelling population made some change to their travel patterns. So people changed their commute patterns, and this wasn't enforced. It just told people this is going to be busy. Why don't you? Here are loads of options you could take. What was interesting is that people stayed changed. So I don't think people who travel to work, commute to work, think about things that change. You learn your route and then you don't really think, oh, no, there's another station that's open. So people tried new routes and they liked them. They found a better way to get to and from work. Ride to Work is a scheme in the UK where you get a discounted bike as long as you're using it to commute. And Ride to Work was massively increased in the numbers in 2012 compared to 2011. Some of that will be because the UK cyclists did really well, but it seems that some of it was due to people trying it out as part of this and then liking it. So how does nudge theory work? What can you do? How do you influence, and what were the levers you can use? So the first attempt that the government had to come up with a framework was a thing called Mindspace. So Mindspace is the mnemonic for 9 different things that influence our behaviour. I will share these slides afterwards. If anyone's making notes, I will share them. So Messenger, it matters who gives us a message. Our incentives matter because we are really keen to avoid losses, far more keen to avoid losses than we are to get gains. We're strongly influenced by norms, by what's the normal thing. And if there is a default, we'll probably just go with it unless we have really strong feeling to not do that. Salience is about what attracts our attention. So if something novel or is relevant to us, then we'll pay attention to it. Priming is the idea that you can get different outcomes depending on things that have happened before. So this is a really long time ago, but there's a program in the UK called Yes Prime Minister that gives a fantastic example of how if you want to do a poll about whether we should reintroduce national service, and national service in the UK expected people to serve in the armed forces, mandatory in the 1950s, I think. If you say, oh, do you think young people welcome some authority and leadership in their lives? Do they respond to a challenge? Would you be in favour of reintroducing national service? You'll get different percentages than if you say, do you think there's a danger in giving young people guns and teaching them how to kill? Do you think we should reintroduce national service? So priming is that. Affect is about your emotional association. So what do you already expect just from experience? Commitments, if you could get people to make a commitment, then to say they're going to do something, they're much more likely to do it. And we like to do things that make us feel better about ourselves, that convince ourselves that we're good people. So this was the first framework. When the Nudge Unit tried to use this, they found it's a lot to remember, and it needed to be distilled into something a bit more, just a little bit more simple. So they came up with a thing called EAST, and EAST is a thing that says you should make things easy, attractive, social, and timely. And I'm just going to talk about each of these. So to make it easy, you should make it as simple as possible to start doing something. We have a strong tendency to go for the default, which is why a decision over opt-in versus opt-out can be important, and clear messages are important. So an example in the UK is the pension scheme. There was a change from opt-in to opt-out. So they started automatically enrolling people into pension scheme, and they had to opt out if they didn't want to be in it. And participation rates rose from 61 to 83%. That's a huge difference, and that's going to make a huge difference to people's lives. The second thing is about making stuff attractive, and there are 2 aspects to making something attractive. The first is get it to attract their attention, and something like personalization can work here. An email to a particular person can work better than a general newsletter. And then think about incentives. So thinking about incentives that would encourage people. They don't have to be large, but that can be attractive too. An example is a test run in a UK investment bank to encourage people to donate a day's salary to charity. So the control group got an email. Another group got an email plus some sweets branded with a charitable giving message, and the difference was significant. They also tried personalizing the emails. So personalizing the emails had a similar effect as doing the sweets. If you had sweets and a personalized email, it led to 17% take up. So 12% increase by saying, dear Sarah, and giving me some sweets. I think this is just really interesting. You can see the impact. Make it social. We are very social beings. If you describe what most people do in a situation and you say that 90% of people in your street have already done this, it's a powerful incentive. And using the network of we all know that like recommendations from someone you know to use a service are much more effective than anything else, really. And then public commitments. Studies show that a public commitment makes it much more likely that something will happen. Charitable giving in wills. So when people are writing a will, around 5% of people will leave some money to charity. It turns out that if you just ask, would you like to leave some money to charity, that goes up to 10%. If you say lots of people, when they're writing their will, leave some money to charity, do you have any cause that you're particularly passionate about? 15% of people leave money to charity. And interestingly, that last group leaves almost twice as much money. The first two leave about the same amount. The last group, it's much more money. So you're really telling people, you are basically saying this is the normal thing to do, and you're tapping into what do people care about. Making it timely. You want to get people at the right time when they're likely to be receptive. And if you've worked in IT, you do not want to be asking a team to do something when they've got a launch next week. People are not good at assessing costs and benefits over the life cycle of something. They focus more on the purchase price of a car than the cost of running it. Lots of things, there are short-term costs and long-term benefits, things like saving for a pension. So an example that I haven't put in here is if you ask people to start saving for a pension now, lots of people won't do it. If you ask those people to commit that in a year they're going to start saving and that they're going to add a little bit more each year, much more likely that they'll do it. And if you can help people make a plan, there's a gap between intentions and behavior. So if people make an action plan, they're more likely to cross that gap. So an example in Norway was that if you want people to buy energy efficient appliances that are more expensive, putting a projected lifetime cost of running an appliance next to all the appliance can make a difference, because people could then see the whole picture. Yes, it's more expensive, but I'm going to save a lot of money over the long term. When I first read the Nudge Unit book, it was really interesting because no one at the FT had read it as far as I know, but I could see that lots of things that we were doing, people were already using some of these things around social aspects and hitting people at the right time. And over the last 5 years, we've done more and more of that nudging as we've sort of really realized the impact it can have. So let's start with easy. How do we make it easy to get started using something new as a developer or a team? And just a reminder of what makes things easy. Things like the hassle factor, the defaults, simplify messages. If you can make things discoverable, engineers can find out it exists. That's your first, it's your first challenge. And at one point at the FT, there was a lot of good documentation, but it was spread in loads of different places. So you had to know which team owned a service to find the documentation about it. So one thing that we did last year was we moved everything to live in a single place called the Tech Hub. So the aim was that you could go to the Tech Hub, you could start there and you could ask a question about how to do something. And then the second thing is that documentation aimed to make it very easy for developers to go ahead and use the tools. So step-by-step guides, explainers, reference docs, client libraries. And we tried to write things aimed at our newest developers, junior developers, new starters, so that people could easily integrate this tool into whatever they already had. And this is an example of the kind of documentation. This is about setting up DNS records. It's very focused on getting started. How do I get access? How do I use it? We took a tech writing course for people in my team to get better at how do we get our message across. We could always do more. Everyone could always do more. The next thing is self-service. You want your tools to be, most of the time, not need any help. And I think this is one of those things that the 80-20 rule applies. 80% of the stuff is pretty standard. Teams should be able to do that without having to talk to you. And then for 20% of the time, maybe they'll come to you and you'll help them because it's new and it's challenging. And that's absolutely fine. You don't have to cover everything. You want to cover the most of the stuff. You want to have a consistent developer experience. It's much easier to pick up a tool if it works exactly the way that other things work and you're not surprised by it. Checklists can really help. So complicated work, having the ability to check off a list helps avoid mistakes. It's about complexity. So this book is great. It talks about dealing with complexity. It's expert guidance, and it's about the things that, it's not the standard things you do all the time, it's the things you might forget. So this book is really about flying a plane and ensuring safe surgery. It can help with software development too. One of the things they mention in this book is why the band Van Halen used to have in their rider for any event that they did, that they wanted a bowl of M&Ms with the brown ones removed. This is one of those rock and roll legends, but it turns out the reason was they have an incredibly complicated setup for running a huge rock show, and they figured that a venue that can't follow one relatively simple set of instructions is never going to manage to successfully and safely stage the show. So at the FT, we developed an engineering checklist. This is a set of things that you needed to do loosely in order to build a new product or feature. And it's focused on things that matter to the company that a team may not think about. So it's not talking about building, testing, deploying code, because that's basic. That's the stuff every team will do and knows how to do. The checklist tells you what you need to do, but it makes it easy for you to do them. So for change and release logging, for example, there was an API. We provided integrations. When I first worked at the FT, this was involved filling out a form in Salesforce. So this is a considerable improvement. And there's a great write-up on the FT's tech blog. Next, how do you make something attractive? Well, a reminder of what makes things attractive. Attracting people's attention, which means communication. And most teams don't do enough communication. Send an email listing the 5 new things they're launching and they consider it done. But you can't assume people read that email, particularly if it's long and talks about lots of different things. So the following tweet is 100% true. One thing that happens in groups of 50 plus is messages never really get to everyone unless you make an extraordinary effort. If you say you can request a free popsicle at any time, someone still doesn't know. So you do need to make an extraordinary effort. You have to talk about this thing until you can't believe there's anyone that doesn't know about it, and you're still wrong. And you need to do it in all your possible communication channels. And if it is more complicated than you can have an ice cream, then you have to really spend even more time explaining it. And the way that this worked for me at the FT was we had monthly newsletters. They worked really well. People would reply to it. They were informal and they had a summary at the top, a too long didn't read section, so that people could see that one line and know whether there was something in there that they would want to read. My colleague Reese created a bunch of these fake O'Reilly covers, posted them in Slack, promoting that the Tech Hub should be the first place to look to answer questions. It's a simple message. Go to tech.in.ft.com, have a look at what's there. And he put them up as posters as well, which was just really great. You want to make sure that something is attractive by making sure it actually solves a problem people have, that it appeals to people. It needs to solve something they care about. It needs to do it better than alternatives, whether they're something they built or something they could buy in. A product team doesn't want to use the bad thing you wrote when they could pay someone else to do it for them. You want to make things safe to use. It's attractive to have a thing where things are dealt with for you, sensible defaults, a small blast radius, secure so that security issues are fixed for the person and policies are complied with so they don't have to worry about it, reliable at the right level of reliability. And importantly, people need to know this is an owned and supported thing that won't disappear under them. And I expect anyone that's worked in tech for a while has been hit by something going end of life. A company gets acquired and their product is sunsetted and suddenly you have a work to do. It applies internally. If you're building things that other people use, whether it's APIs or tools, you don't want to get a reputation for pulling the plug. If you do have to do it for some reason, you need to make that a good experience for people. An example at the FT was around DNS. So we used to use Dyn. It got bought by Oracle, who shut it down. So we brought a proposal to the tech governance group at the FT with 7 months notice. And the new solution used infrastructure as code. It made things better for customers, and as much as possible of that migration was done for those customers. So giving them something better and making that clear is really important. So the change API I mentioned earlier is actually the second version. And when we released it, we told people why it was better. It's far more resilient. It has a Circle CI orb. It is a much better thing, and people adopted it really rapidly. What about making things social? So social is about showing what others are doing, using a network, encouraging a public commitment. You want to start by showing off that the tools you've built are being used and successfully. Cultivate a culture where people share what they're doing. The FT had a culture where people spoke, did lightning talks, presentations, there were newsletters, and that's fun and people learn stuff, but good things get around as well. If you can get a team to talk about how they adopted the tool that you built and how they like it, you'll find other people are more likely to adopt it too. And you should make it easy for people to see how they're doing. So if you want teams to make a change, show them how they compare to other teams. An example for that at the FT is for system runbooks. So this is things that provide information on how to fix and troubleshoot a service. And we want critical systems to have good runbooks so that people can find the relative information. So we introduced a thing where we scored them. We had a set of fields where we knew we needed information, and it worked very well to improve the runbooks. We gamified it a bit. So we aggregated the scores for systems into teams, into groups, and there was a bit of a leaderboard, and I would get Slack messages like this. Oh, this is a colleague of mine saying, hey, Sarah, we've overtaken you. What's interesting there is that this is the response from my team. Wouldn't get too comfy, and we overtake them back. And what I like here is that it made documentation a bit more fun. Documentation is generally a thing people are not that excited about. Get an agreement on when a team will tackle something. This is that action plan thing. And you can use OKRs or other planning tools to make a plan for when a team will tackle something. I've found that it is much easier to get something put into a plan for 3 months' time, where people are not really, you say, will you do that next quarter? Oh, yes, we'll put it on the plan. Once it's on the plan, much more likely that next quarter it will be one of the things that team does. This is where this automated scoring for our runbooks really paid off. We didn't really understand this was going to happen, but with an OKR, which are objectives and key results, you have to measure progress. You need to have a measurable key result. And we had given every team at the FT an easy thing to measure. So there were lots of OKRs that said we're going to improve our runbooks by 10% this quarter. Timely. Timely is about picking the right time to do something. So get them at the right time, help people think about the overall cost and benefits. You need to communicate repeatedly and via different mechanisms. This is that thing that people won't pay attention when it doesn't matter to them. So repeat it every month or so, and then suddenly someone will go, oh yeah, I need to do that. Work that you need another team to do shouldn't come as a surprise to them. And you should talk too about the things you're planning to do, because there's nothing worse than having a plan to do some work and then find out that an internal team has a solution for it, but they just hadn't announced it. Going back to that engineering checklist, I don't think many engineers would read this end to end. The best way to guide people is to build things so that at the point you're trying to achieve one of these things on the checklist, you're guided to do the right thing. So point 4, which is added to BizOps. BizOps is the FT's internal system registry. So there should be a record for every system. We want new systems to be added into BizOps. When you create a new record for a system in BizOps, you define it as part of it a unique system code. So to nudge people to do this, we have every AWS resource is tagged with a system code. You'll find it really hard to get to production without a system code, and you get it from BizOps. So it's a pretty strong nudge to developers. And talk about long-term benefits, long-term cost reductions, because people really pay attention to what it's going to cost them now. So when we migrated to containers at the FT, we knew it was going to take time that we could have been using to build features, but we also knew we could save maybe 40% of our hosting costs. It was worth doing the maths on that and saying, this is where we get break even on this. And make sure you help people plan. So you need to be ahead of other people when you come to planning if you're going to ask them to do stuff. So I've talked about why I think being able to influence behaviour is an important skill, and I've introduced nudge theory in these frameworks, showed you examples of how to make things easy, social, attractive and timely. Thanks a lot for listening. I will share the slides after this for anyone who's interested. And I think I have time for questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for a really powerful presentation. I can't wait to apply the learnings. Special thank you to a wonderful audience. Thank you for being so proactive and for all of your support. I hope that you feel inspired and that we see you again soon. Sarah, all the best from us, Women in Agile Bulgaria.
Thank you for inviting. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I will share the slides, and that will have information about where to find all the books, etc.
We appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Have a wonderful evening. Goodbye.
Okay. Thank you all. Goodbye.